Well, I guess I have to say good morning and good afternoon and good evening today because we have a broad international audience. Really, it is an honor to be here today to celebrate your new book, Rabbi,
Thank you.
and Minds, which I had the privilege of reading. You sent me before it was coming out, and it really struck me at the time, and rereading it in preparation for today, it has continued to strike me in its sort of in its brilliance and its ability to really take on so many subjects. And I'm sure those in the audience who know you expected nothing less than that. For those who do not have the privilege of knowing Rabbi Dunner, I will introduce him briefly. Rabbi Dunner hails from a prominent European rabbinic family that survived the Holocaust and ended up in London. Following his yeshiva studies in England, the United States, and Israel, Rabbi Dunner majored in Jewish history at University College London and went on to launch the Sachi Synagogue for postgraduate professional singles in London's West End. He is currently serving as senior rabbi at Young Israel of North Beverly Hills. In 2018, Rabbi Dunner released his first book, Mavericks, Mystics, and False Messiahs, and last month released his latest work, Hearts and Minds, which is why we are here today to discuss really the ideas, the subjects you, I think, very bravely take on in this work.
Well, thank you, Avital, and you failed to mention in that mini bio that I knew your husband when he was still in diapers, because I was assistant rabbi to his father in Moscow in 1991 and 1992. And I remember that period of time very well. It was just after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the emergence of democracy in Russia. Yeltsin had just come into power, and the entire world had been upended. The Cold War was over, and the Jewish community was beginning to come into itself. And that was my formative rabbinic experience as the assistant to your father-in-law, Rabbi Pinchas Goldschmidt, who was at that time a young rabbi at the Archipova, Ulitsa Archipova synagogue, the Moscow Choral Synagogue, which is in the center of Moscow, and which was a focal point for Jewish life even through the communist period. And I have to tell you, I had many formative moments during my early period in the rabbinic world. I'm sure we'll be speaking about them as we talk about some of the subjects I cover in my book. But I'm going to let you lead the way and ask me questions and perhaps try and coax out of me things that I might not have said, because it's easy for me to talk. I'm a rabbi after all. So I'll leave the questioning to you and see if you can probe information out of me that I might not have said.
I will just add that you should be warned as a journalist and also as a Rebbitzin. I know well how to spot the things that are left unspoken by rabbis and know how to dig deeper into them. So be prepared.
I'm prepared.
All right. First of all, your experiences in Moscow probably deserve a book of their own. I just want to put that out there. And I think anyone, and I have spoken about this with my father-in-law as well, anyone who was there during that time, I think it's a fascinating story and hasn't really been even explored as fully as I think it must.
You know what, Avital, I'll share one story.
Please.
Can I share one story? It's
yes.
like
if it's not Russia, I will always let you share a story.
It's such a great story. So there was a discussion, and I enabled it, of a school group coming from London, from Hasmonean School in London, to split up. One group to be in Moscow, one group to be in St. Petersburg. There'd never been a formal organized trip from a Jewish school in London, of course, throughout the period of communist Soviet Union. But now it was possible. They had a man on the ground. I was the man. And I helped organize it, this first trip. And it was sixth formers, so 12th graders. They came to Moscow. Some of them went off to St. Petersburg. And I think we were left with about 20 or 25 boys in Moscow. And they were studying there with some of the youngsters in the shul. And we also took them around to various places of interest. Anyway, guess what? I mean, this is going to hardly surprise you, But the bus that I had organized and paid for to pick them up at 8 o'clock in the morning to take them on their day trip didn't turn up. And we're all standing out there on the street. It was, I can't remember if it was February or March. It was very cold. And we're standing on the street. We're waiting for 20 minutes, half an hour. The bus doesn't come. There's no one to call. There's no cell phones. I just didn't know what to do. I mean, so the rabbis who came from London, the teachers, they said, it's okay, so we'll find something else to do. Maybe there's somewhere we can walk to. Just then, a city bus pulled up at a bus stop just outside the synagogue, or very close by. And I said, hold on a minute. And I went with my interpreter to the bus. And I went inside the bus and he said, you want to pay for your ticket? I said, no. I've got a bunch of boys here from the West, from London, and we need the bus. He says, how much? So I took out, I can't remember what it was. It wasn't a lot of money. It was maybe $20. And I gave it to him. I said, can we have the bus for the day? So he got out of his seat and he turned towards all the passengers in the bus who'd obviously paid for their tickets. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, this bus has now terminated here and you all have to get off. And they all got off the bus and all the Hasmonean boys got on the bus and they had a city bus for the rest of the day. That was Moscow in 1992.
That is a perfect encapsulation of Russia, and perhaps some things have not changed since then. That's very good. It's a great story. I wanted to move on to your book, if that's okay.
Sure.
I think that the book is extremely unique in that it is an expression really of your erudition, the way you were able to weave history, art, and Jewish thought, I would say culture and Jewish thought, into short chapters on the weekly parsha. For those who know you, it is no surprise that is your work. But I think for sort of a wider audience, it is very compelling. And it seems to me that it is also a reflection of your rather fascinating journey as a rabbi, which I noted in your bio, and you also added on, importantly, your experience in Moscow, but also specifically your service in Young Israel North Beverly Hills, which Rabbi Stav, I believe, described as that has taught you to, quote, introduce the world of Torah concepts to different audiences. And I was wondering if we could start there. Maybe I would love to hear from you how your experience is as a pulpit rabbi, working with Jews of all backgrounds, right, has really informed your philosophy as both as a pastoral leader as well as an intellectual leader.
So it's an important question, and I'm going to address it from a very rabbinic point of view, and I'm talking about professional rabbinic. I'm often asked, which particular school do you come from? And it's a question that many rabbis are asked. If you're an Orthodox rabbi, did you study in this yeshiva or that yeshiva? Did you go through yeshiva university? Who are your formative rebbeim? Are you Lubavitch? Or if you're conservative, did you go to the Jewish Theological Seminary? If you're Reform, Hebrew Union College, and who were your professors? Who were your rabbis? And it's a question that many rabbis are asked. And you can often hear in the drosha that a rabbi gives on Shabbos. It's very unusual to hear a drosha from a Lubavitcher shliach at his Chabad house, and he doesn't mention the Lubavitcher Rebbe. That's his formative mentor, as it were. Then you've got somebody who's studied at Yeshiva University. I mean, clearly, in most of his Shabbos droshas, if not all, he's going to mention the Rav. He's going to mention Rabbi Soloveitchik. Which particular school did I emerge from? Well, I went to many, but I would say that I'm the son of none. And the reason for that is because the world that I emerged from, which is the world of Yekus, the Germanic Ashkenaz Jewish world, no longer has a school of its own. So those who come from a Yeki background, as I do, my grandfather was a rabbi for 70 years, was born in Cologne. He studied at the Berlin Rabbinical Seminary, which of course closed down because the Nazis closed it down in the 1930s, never reopened anywhere else. And there's no similar rabbinic institution in the world. And I'm a fifth generation rabbi. That means that my grandfather's uncle, great uncle were rabbis. My grandfather's great uncle, after whom he is named, was the chief rabbi of Holland already in the 19th century, real Yekis, proper Yekis. And the school that they emerged from, and to which I would say I really subscribe, is the school of Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. And that's a school of Torah im Derech Eretz. It's a school which believes that there's much that the world has to offer, which is pertinent to the Jewish experience. And there's much that Judaism has to offer that's pertinent to the world experience or the human experience. And that being the case, one has to try and merge and fuse the two in such a way that the human experience, the world experience, and the Jewish experience are all one. Torah im Derech Eretz, one and the other. They suffuse each other with their qualities. The one thing I'll say is that Rabbi Hirsch was very firm, that if in any way that which the world has to offer is going to undermine your faith in Judaism, your faith in God, your commitment to what is expected of you as a Jew, then that particular type of experience is wrong for you. You mustn't allow the world to interfere with who you are as a Jew, but it can certainly enhance who you are as a Jew. And what I've done in my articles, weekly articles over the past many years, now I must say I already thanked in my introduction in the book, which you'll read, those of you who have not yet read it, but I want to make mention of it, is that the person who really encouraged me to write like this was a friend of mine here in Beverly Hills, George Schaefer. George told me at the very beginning of my tenure here at Young Israel of North Beverly Hills, he says, "You've got so much to say about the world, I find what you say fascinating, but when you write Divrei Torah, you seem to stick to Torah concepts, and that doesn't really engage me." And he says, I'm telling you openly, I'm telling you what other people are probably thinking. What you've got to do is do what you do when you're in conversation with me and with others, where so much of your experience in the wider world comes into play when you talk about what it means to be a Jew, and try and bring that out in your writing. And that really encouraged me to write articles where I tackled the most arcane topics possible, whether it's psychology or art or science, and found messages in the Torah that either enhanced what one can learn from those particular spheres of knowledge, or which could teach us about the Torah. So something in psychology can teach us something about the parsha of the week, or something in art can enhance our understanding of a particular narrative in the Torah. And that's what I've tried to do in this book. There's 160 articles in there. I've written many more, but obviously there's only so many pages that you can publish and a person can hold the book. But this is, and it's not an insignificant book, it's 700 and something pages, but 160 articles covering every possible topic you can imagine.
I felt that this book also, to me, and maybe my lens are colored, but it felt very much born out of 2020, right? What pushed you to put this book out now?
Well, a lot of people have complained that 2020, or let's call it the COVID year, has been a wasted year. I was very conscious early on of two things. First of all, I wasn't going to allow any pandemic to get the better of me. I wasn't going to allow myself to just be dragged along by circumstances beyond my control. And every challenge creates opportunity. And what I felt was, here I have an opportunity to present the product of my literary pen to a wider audience. I've got the time, because we're in isolation, we're quarantined, to edit my material, to give it into a publisher, to have it, and there were quite a few people who helped me go through the material as well, and to publish something so that I can end the pandemic thinking, you know what, I didn't waste my time. There were times, which in a normal year I would have used differently. I was regularly visiting people, going to events and doing all kinds of communal activities, which I couldn't possibly do during COVID, and I didn't waste a moment. I wanted to make sure that there would be some product of 2020 which I could look back on and say, you know what, that was a year when I did something which I wouldn't have done had it not been for the pandemic. That was the first consideration.
You were following Shakespeare's Mahalach of writing King Lear during the pandemic, right?
Absolutely. That exactly right. I'll tell you something else, and this really struck me early on. You know, very early on, I lost someone to COVID, a family member. I wrote an obituary. I was thinking to myself as I was writing it, I mean, who could have predicted that he was going to die? He was in good health. He was older, he was in his 80s, but he was in good health. There was no reason for him to die. And then you began to hear stories of people in their 50s and their 60s, even in their 40s, dying from COVID in the Jewish world. And they were publishing lists. This is last year Pesach time. They were publishing lists of people who were dying as a result of COVID. And I realized, you know what? We've come face to face with our own mortality. Now, of course, the vast majority of us were not going to die, even if we caught COVID. By the way, I had COVID in September and I got through it and I'm fine. And I've since been vaccinated. But the point is, we came face to face with mortality in a way that probably none of us in our lives, in our ordinary day-to-day lives, have ever had to deal with before. Because yes, of course, if you have a terminal illness, you're facing mortality. But, you know, if you have a terminal illness, occasionally you survive, but sometimes you don't. And you know through the course of that what is going to happen or what could happen. But here we were faced with something which was intangible. We could catch COVID. It was possible that we would contract this virus and that the way we would react, it was such a capricious virus. We don't know how our body is going to react to it, and we could die. Now, looking back, how would I feel had I caught the virus, had I not been able to survive it, if I would have wasted all the material that I had collated over the years, all the work that I put into my learning, to my studies, to my research? How would I feel about that? And I thought to myself, you know what? I don't know what's going to happen. I'm going to make every effort to ensure that all the literary and Jewish study projects that I'm involved in will somehow, by the way, not just Jewish, and charity projects as well, many different charitable projects that I was involved in, all kinds of things. I wanted to make sure I was going to put every effort into them to make sure that if somehow I wasn't going to get through this, I was going to come out of it, or at least something would come out of it despite my demise. Chas v'sholom, and thank God it didn't happen. The point is, we do not know the day of our death. We just don't know it. And we have to take the opportunities that we have, that every day we wake up in the morning, we need to say, thank you, Hashem, that I'm alive, I'm able to do something, and I can make a difference in the world. Not just go through the motions, because that's what so many of us do. I want to make a difference. What can I do today to make a difference? And that really became a focus during 2020 and now in early 2021, and I know we're coming out of it. And that's really, I think, what lay behind my strong push in the summer of last year of 2020 to get this book published.
I think what the wake-up call that you're describing, I think many of us experienced in different ways, right? People woke up and realized our time on this earth is limited, and what were we doing anyways, right? We were rushing off to the office, and what were we exactly doing in that office? I mean, I know many young people who have shifted careers, left jobs, started new jobs, realizing, you know, this is really what I want to do. What I was doing before was not really me. Or creating, as you did, creating new entities, creating art, writing, whatever it is that attempt at immortality through leaving a legacy, right? I think so many people have gone through that experience and felt it sort of very secretly. But I think it is very honest and vulnerable of you to share that with us, that realization, your personal realization. It really is, it strikes very close to home to me. In your introduction, you write that there is no such thing as a code of silence in Judaism. You write that if silence prevailed, there would be no wisdom in the world. Even the partial or selective silence of rabbis and Torah teachers is antithetical to the glorious Jewish heritage that has seen us survive. And it will be the power of words that will propel us to our ultimate future, the messianic age of redemption and salvation. As a religious journalist, I was quite taken by this description, as you can imagine. It is actually rather radical, I think, in an age of I think, fears of cancel culture or whatever it is. The the culture of social media today, where there is so much chatter, there is so much white noise, and yet at the same time, people are afraid to take certain stances. And I think, particularly and unfortunately, in many of our own communities, nonconformist voices are often routinely silenced. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean by this. What do you mean regarding the power of words to bring redemption?
I'm going to give you two answers. They're complementary, but they are both important. And I mentioned it as well in the introduction. I kind of knew that you were going to ask me this question, because I knew that when I wrote that, it's a radical idea. But it's a really important concept. And I'll begin by saying this. I'm a student of the Talmud. Our religion, Judaism, is a religion of the Talmud. It's a religion of the Torah, but it's a religion of the Torah that's based around the Talmudic interpretation of Torah. And the Talmud is an incredible, all-encompassing work. It's one of the most radical pieces of legal and national literature ever produced. I know that people study Daf Yomi, and I often have discussions with those who are studying Daf Yomi to say that today's Daf really didn't talk to me. And I always say to them, yeah, I understand it didn't talk to you. It's a bit the material's a little bit odd or legalistic, or it's not kind of relevant to your life. But just imagine the people who wrote that, writing at a time when having an independent opinion was frowned upon, and yet they were willing to attack accepted norms. And I'm not going to go into details because I don't want this to turn into a Talmudic lecture, but I'm happy to give examples if anybody wants to get in touch with me afterwards. But they were willing to take on subjects that were so much a way out of the normal way of life, so marginal, and somehow absorb them into the discussions of the Talmud, that it's almost overwhelming. And you just have to have such respect for these people that they're willing to challenge each other and themselves regarding topics that were central to what it meant to be a Jew. And it's, the Gemara sometimes is very wordy. It's very verbose and goes off at a tangent, and yet it's very well edited. There's no line of Gemara that's there for no purpose. And we don't always know what the purpose is, by the way. The Mefarshim, the commentaries on the Talmud, don't always understand why in that particular time and place the Amoraim decided to include a particular piece of information or narrative or whatever it is. But the very fact that it's there speaks volumes to me. And I feel that as a student of the Talmud, that I should emulate the lesson that I absorbed in studying Talmud. No subject is off limits. There's nothing that you can't talk about. And don't just stick to something that's comfortable, which brings me on to my second point. This morning somebody sent me a link. It's a letter signed by 75 rabbis, mainly in Lakewood, not just in Lakewood, New Jersey, banning the use of marijuana, which is about to be legalized in New Jersey. Now, I don't know anything about the legalization of marijuana in New Jersey. I know it's been legalized in California. I didn't sign a letter banning marijuana for my community. I'm not sure that anybody in my community uses marijuana. I'm sure not, but that's not the point. I was very struck by that letter. And the reason I was struck by the letter was because it's a letter about a topic that the audience who's reading it is in broad agreement about. Drugs are a bad thing. That's, accepted wisdom. And marijuana is a drug, and it's a gateway to who knows what. I mean, we've all been educated about drugs. And therefore, just because it's legalized doesn't mean that we should have it in our lives. 75 rabbis in Lakewood obviously agree with that point of view, and they signed the letter, and I don't know who went round to get the letter signed, but there you have it. But I don't see that 75 rabbis in Lakewood have signed a letter about alcoholism, or about obesity, or about so many other topics that may affect their communities, which are equally daunting. In fact, without getting too personal, over the past year, some of the activities within their communities have not adhered to the law, and yet I didn't see letters from 75 rabbis where they decried breaking the law in the face of the restrictions that were being imposed generally to prevent the spread of COVID. Signing an easy letter is not taking a stand. It's just joining a bandwagon. Signing a difficult letter or writing a difficult article about a topic which is slightly contentious and controversial, now that's taking a stand. That's leadership. That's true leadership. That's the power of words. Words that just become, background noise, become static on your radio, on your TV, that's of no interest. No one's going to read that letter and look at any of the names of the rabbis who signed it and think to themselves, I'm really surprised that rabbi signed a letter banning marijuana. I mean, I would have thought that he'd be pro-marijuana. No one's going to think that. In which case, why waste your ink? I think that Judaism, as expressed in the Talmud, is a religion, is a faith that has survived because it has tackled difficult topics in areas where people are not necessarily in agreement, and those who are representatives or leaders have been willing to make statements that are controversial, not always agreed. We have so many incidents in the Talmud where a rabbi comes out with a controversial opinion and everyone says, you're wrong. And in the end, he either concedes or doesn't concede. It's not important. But there it is, recorded in the Talmud. Because you've got to say it. If there's a truth to it, you've got to say it. Don't just join a bandwagon. Don't take the easy route. Don't simply become the dog that was wagged by the tail.
It's a very powerful point, and something that I certainly relate to as a journalist. Those very same questions are often questions I face as a reporter when I sort of have to decide what topic I'm going to report on. And there's sort of the low-hanging fruit, the easy thing, signing a letter that says marijuana should not be used in our communities. And then there's the much harder, much more contentious stories, but those that are actually, to my mind, more necessary for the health of our communities. I'm wondering.
I wrote in my book, and I don't know if you read those articles, if you saw them, a number of times about the poor education of the Jewish schools, some of the Jewish schools on the East Coast, but across the Jewish world, because of the I don't know what it is, but this cultural desire to separate themselves from the world at large, and therefore they're not teaching basic skills, whether it's language or whether it's in math, arithmetic, or basic sciences and social studies. I wrote a number of articles about that, but what I didn't include in the book, and I'm not sure if it's widely known, is correspondence I had over the past couple of years with senior rabbinic leaders in the United States of America about this topic. And what struck me most in their responses was that we don't want to change, even though we know change, in some instances is necessary, but we're going to resist change because resisting change is what has allowed us to survive. I couldn't disagree more. I think it's change that has enabled us to survive. It's our ability to adapt. It's our ability, I'll give you an example, to go from a temple model where we brought korbanot and where we were led by Kohanim into a world where the leadership became the rabbis and the center of gravity was the yeshiva. That's what enabled the post-temple destruction generation to survive. And it's why we're here as Jews, all those who clung to this Temple of Jerusalem model as the only possible route to Judaism and the be-all and end-all of the Jewish faith. It was them who didn't survive. We need to adapt. It doesn't mean we need to become Reformed Jews, but we need to be able to see that there's benefit in absorbing the world around us for the furtherance of Jewish life. And I think that that's a lesson I learned from the Talmud. I've already mentioned Hirsch, and that's very much a message that I want to project in the articles that I write, that there's so much to learn and so much to know, and the rejection or marginalization of any knowledge is so dangerous for the future of Jewish life.
Right. You write actually quite a bit about the importance of being mechadesh, coming up with new ideas, new interpretations of the Torah. And I want to add one more point to what you just said about sort of the importance of access to knowledge. I think is so important. And one of the other challenges that I think many communities will face is a certain structure which allows gatekeeping of knowledge, right? Only some people are allowed to really engage with whatever intellectualism that is not permitted for the masses. And I mean, to my mind, that's pretty troubling and feels antithetical to really what Judaism is all about.
I'm a big believer in the democratization of knowledge, not just Jewish knowledge, of all knowledge. It's something that the internet world, the World Wide Web has enabled. It's not always necessarily in a good way, but the democratization of knowledge is incredibly important. Nobody should ever feel that somebody knows better than them and therefore can make decisions for them if that person is in a position to manipulate them, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And those people who have the power of knowledge, as we've seen throughout history, are just ready and able and willing to exploit those without knowledge.
Yeah, I think, going off of that, your work felt to me, especially, sort of in the introduction, but really throughout, the specter of Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, I think really shines through. Because also I think you are very similar in your style of sort of taking an obscure piece of history or an obscure poem that no one has ever read before except for you, and connecting it to the Parsha. And that is something that he was really able to do so artfully. I think we were incredibly blessed, and I think we also took for granted that we had that powerful and eloquent voice that could relate Torah thought to communities of all kinds, to Jews and non-Jews alike. And I was wondering, piggybacking off of what you just said, right? What is the future to your mind of rabbinic moral authority in the wake of his loss, and especially in an era where we are dealing with, I think, real fear of change, fear of standing up, where those in power sort of choose to take on the easy subjects, right, and not take on the hard things. How do we get out of this?
So first, let me begin by paying tribute to one of the greatest rabbis of my rabbinic career and probably of everybody's Jewish life over the past 30, 40 years. He was an extraordinary man, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And what's interesting about him is that, and I've said this in other forums as well, that he could have been a great philosophy professor in an Ivy League university or in Oxford or in Cambridge or wherever he wanted, and he could have written books on philosophy, and at least 12 people would have read them, and perhaps 25 people would have known about him. But he decided he was going to popularize his expertise, and he was going to speak to the masses. And you should know that somebody who has the, I'm not suggesting that he had it, but somebody who has the pomposity of their intellectual, prowess is very unlikely to do that, because they look with disdain and condescendingly at those who know less than them. And yet he was able, despite his great promise as a philosophy major from Cambridge, to become a rabbi for the people who could convey these complex philosophical topics in a language that was understandable even to those who'd never studied, never mind philosophy, but never studied in university, that they could absorb this information. That was a great skill. It's an incredible skill to use your knowledge and your ability to convey that knowledge and be willing to share it with a wide audience. That was something for which he deserves the greatest praise, and I write about him in the book, and of course he's quoted numerous times in the book, and he was a mentor to me in that way, that I learnt from him that it's possible to take a poem and use information from that poem or an emotion from that poem to help you understand a difficult passage in the Torah or the Talmud. It's important to do that. Don't ever imagine that poetry and Talmud are two separate bodies of work. They can be fused with each other, that there is a place that they can meet and that they should meet. So that's the first thing. But I think that the important thing about his legacy, and I really want to stress this, he was a bridge builder. I would like to be a bridge builder. He was a bridge builder because, despite the fact that he came from this kind of secular space, university, academia, he was an intellectual. He was somebody who could probably have a deep and meaningful discussion about a philosophical topic in a totally secular way. And yet he was a deeply religious man. He was a rabbi. He had a lovely voice. He used to love singing. And I spoke about in my hesped that I gave for him, I spoke about a meeting that I arranged between him and Shlomo Carlebach. He loved Shlomo Carlebach, but not just Shlomo Carlebach. He loved chazanut. He loved singing. He had that emotional side to him, that very religious, that faith-based, almost Hasidic, because of his Lubavitch connections. This Hasidic element to his Judaism. He was a bridge builder. He built bridges between all these different worlds. The world of the academic, the world of those who had faith and those who didn't have faith. Those who had knowledge and those who didn't have knowledge. And he managed to bring them all together and be their representative, and to be their mentor, and to be their inspiration. And that's something I'd like to be able to do. I don't know if I can do it ever as well as he did it, but that's certainly something I'd like to be able to do. To bring together all these different strands of Jewish life, and even bring those from the non-Jewish world who are lovers of Judaism or lovers of Israel, and who love what it is that we represent as a historical nation that has survived the vicissitudes of history. I want to bring everyone together into one place so that we can all learn from each other and give to each other. And that would be a wonderful thing. And that's something that I try to very much to convey in my book, in the many different topics that I addressed.
You do, and I would love to bring a few examples from your book concretely of I think examples in which you follow Rabbi Sacks's legacy. And I'm sorry to get political here, but I'm a journalist. On Parshat Shemot, you make a fascinating point, I would say, about Paro addressing his people. And you suggest perhaps it was at a rally where he says, Hine am b'nei Yisrael rav v'atzum mimenu. And you say, Paro is speaking to the Egyptians and saying, and creating this myth that the Jewish people are great and stronger than us, and we should be afraid of them. And you describe this essentially as the first sort of conspiracy theory, politically weaponized conspiracy theory, You write that the route from his incendiary rhetoric to violence, enslavement, and genocide was short and sharp. And you write plenty about the dangers of those theories, which endanger the future of democracy and freedom as we know it, that are so cherished in this country. I think that is a rather brave statement to make for a rabbi in an era where anything sort of can be politically misconstrued. And even making something so, your point is really moral. It's not political, right? How do you navigate that?
It's not easy. And I try and weave between different political persuasions. I don't want to be identified too much with the right or too much with the left. The one thing about politics that has always struck me since my early adulthood is the fact that politics thrives on fear. That's really what politics is all about. If you watch elections, all elections are exactly the same. Both sides have got the same message. Details of the message may be different, but it's the same message. The message is, if you vote for the other guy, your life is over. It's all going to be terrible. It's a disaster. Vote for us and you're safe. Weirdly enough, that's exactly what the other guy is saying. If you vote for them, you're in danger, but vote for them, for the other guy, and you'll be safe. It thrives on fear. By creating an other, that's how you will survive. By creating an opposition, you elevate yourself. That's really what politics is all about. But that's not what Judaism is all about. Judaism has countless references to how we must help the underdog, how we must assist those in need, both within our world and beyond our world. And of course, if there are enemies, we must attack them. And we must make sure that they are thwarted before they cause any danger, or they must be vanquished if they cause that danger that they threatened. That is, the survival technique of any person who's rational. But it's not because somebody else, I live in this country. I just became a United States citizen last week. And I live in this country, and I everybody tells me that they're a true American, but if you speak to somebody who votes in one way or speak to somebody who votes in another way, what their definition of a true American will be totally different from the other one. But there must be one thing that unites us all. There must be one common purpose. The goodness of humanity, helping others, finding ways to find common ground with each other. We have to have a common destiny. There has to be a common destiny. We all live and inhabit the same country, the same territory, whatever that territory may be. It doesn't matter, by the way, if you're from the United States or if you're from the United Kingdom, if you're from any country in the world, if you're living in Israel. Now that Israel is in the midst of an election, and all you hear is about how if you vote for the other party, the whole country is going to fall apart. But we all know what's going to happen in the end. It's going to be more or less the same thing, right? 60% of the country, roughly, is right-wing. Some of them support the current Prime Minister and some of them don't. But in the end, will there be a coalition or won't there? It's just a question of how many seats each party has. That's the way the country works. So why is it that we have to spread hatred?
I'm wondering, both as a Rav and as an observer of politics, a keen observer, how do you explain that pull that I think that politics of fear and hatred that you so eloquently describe from both sides, totally from both sides, from both political parties, from both extremes, on our communities? Is it social media that sort of has imposed this constant this constant fear, this constant illusion that we are under attack? What are you seeing?
I don't know if I included this piece in the book. I can't remember, but there was this rabbi during the Civil War, just before the Civil War. I can't remember exactly. His name was Morris Raphael, who gave a pro-slavery sermon and spoke about slavery being in the Bible, and that if you're a religious person, you can be pro-slavery. And there is this desire, particularly among Jews, but not only among Jews, to try and get the zeitgeist right and to be within that zeitgeist. We're chameleons. The Jewish nation has survived because whichever country we're in, we adopt their customs and we adopt their behavior and we adopt their mores and we adopt their culture. That's what we do. I have an English accent, but my parents weren't English. My father was German and my mother was Dutch, and I'm English as it's an accident of the Holocaust. Otherwise I'd be German, right? So the fact that I have an English accent is only because I was born in London and I've adopted that. I don't want to tell you I don't like Monty Python. I do like Monty Python. And of course, I'm a loyal subject of Her Majesty the Queen. It goes without saying, but what does that actually mean? It only means that I want to adapt and blend into the environment of my youth, which was London. Now I live in the United States. I've got to adopt all the cultural aspects of what it means to be living in the United States. So if I live in a particular community, I adopt their behavior. So if that community is left-wing, I become left-wing. If that community is right-wing, I become right-wing. If that community believes in owning guns, I've got to become a gun owner. And if that community believes I mustn't own a gun, then I've definitely got to be against gun ownership. Why? Why can't I just adopt an objective attitude to the things that matter? Is owning a gun a good thing? Now, I have to tell you that during the riots of the past summer, I had a gun in my house because people told me that there were going to be threats to the Beverly Hills neighborhood. And in fact, there was graffiti and there were marches through Beverly Hills neighborhood. But the only reason I had a gun in my house is because I knew that the rioters had guns. But if you ask me, do I think it's a good thing for people who are not trained in the use of guns to have guns? I think it's a terrible thing. I grew up in England and I realised there that there's far less gun crime because there's far less guns. It's a fact. Don't tell me. Of course it needs a human being to shoot a gun, but they have to have a gun in the first place in order to shoot it. Now that's a debate that's impossible to have in a gun-owning community which believes very forcefully that people need to have the right to own guns, to have guns. I just think that that's something. I'm just giving one example. There's so many examples where you're not able to speak your mind because you feel somehow you're blocked in, you're closed in, you can't speak out because if you speak out, people are going to think you're a terrible person. I don't think that anybody who's a gun owner is a terrible person, and I don't think that somebody who isn't a gun owner and is against gun ownership is a terrible person. I think they both have valid points of view, and it's a debate as to what is the best way forward, for example, for gun ownership. That's something that should be discussed in an objective fashion. And that's really what I try and do in my writing and in my speaking and in all my discussions with people about any topic, to go and to adopt the Greek philosophy attitude, which is we strip any subject of any preconceptions, whatever that subject may be. Doesn't matter if we're talking about, killing babies, or if we're talking about whether or not there should be democracy. Let's strip it of any preconceptions. I don't have a point of view. Now, argue the point of view. Is democracy a good thing or is it a bad thing? Killing babies or, whatever it is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I think I come, even without preconceptions, with some ideas to the table, but it doesn't mean I have to have an opinion simply because I belong in a certain community or I live within a certain environment.
I think I have room for time for just one more question, if that's okay.
I'm looking at my clock. It says 10:49, so I think we have a few more minutes if we're to complete the hour.
And I would really love to wrap up the discussion with landing on this week's parsha, actually.
Sure.
Thoughts on this week's parsha, Parshat Vayikra, were very particularly compelling to me. You, in one of your chapters on this, and you have various insights on the parashiyot, but in one of your chapters in Vayikra, you quote Confucius, which was a great line that I've never heard before. If you make a mistake and do not correct it, this is called a mistake. I thought that was just perfect. And that's right. And culpable, right? And you explain that, and you use that beautifully to explain the temple sacrifices as delineated in the book of Vayikra, which are generally very difficult to relate to, right? Something that I've always struggled with. And you really kind of spoke to that question of how do we relate to this whole book, which describes a service in a temple, which is so foreign, and specifically the sacrifices. And you point out that it is important for us to learn from this that the human condition is to make mistakes, right? The sacrifices are an atonement for mistakes, and specifically that we are also obligated to acknowledge those mistakes. You write that the sin sacrifice gives a practical application to an important value, the acknowledgement of one's mistakes and the opportunity to learn from them. By offering up a sin sacrifice, we are reminded of our error in a formal setting, even if the error was entirely innocent. And in it, you bring in some great examples of genius physicists, specifically, who have made mistakes and then acknowledge them. And I think this demand of real cheshbon nefesh, that internal introspection, and also sort of the ability to say, I was wrong, formally, to acknowledge that, is really necessary and contemporary. It's right. It's necessary for our time.
I was very struck, Avital, when I first got to the United States, and I received my first car insurance card. Have you ever read it? Nobody ever reads it, right? But my problem is I read everything. So I read my insurance card, and in the insurance card it says in little writing, if you're ever involved in a car accident, don't admit that you're at fault. Look at your card, that's what it says on it. Do not admit you're at fault. Can you imagine that? Now, what happens if you have a car accident and you know that it's your fault? Your insurance company has instructed you that you're not allowed to admit that you made a mistake. You miscalculated, you went through the red light, you were reckless, whatever it was. You're not allowed to admit it. Why? Because there's financial liability that's involved, or there's other consequences that could happen as a result of admitting fault. That is so embedded into modern Western culture.
I was going to ask, American or is that Western?
I don't know if it's the human condition or Western culture. It's so much embedded into Western culture. You see it in politics. You see it in business. And I know that there are financial considerations that, when you admit to a mistake, you could lose a lot of money, but you're never allowed to admit mistakes. But unfortunately, and I don't know whether in politics and in business it's the right thing. That's a separate discussion. I don't want to go into that now. What bothers me is it has become embedded into the personal lives of every human being. That, a married couple, people make mistakes. Can you say sorry? It's so important to say sorry. You made a mistake. I made a mistake. Now, it could be that the apology won't be accepted, but you've got to admit that you made a mistake. And in friendships, in relationships, not important things, not where there are financial considerations or political consequences, just relationship consequences. Can you admit that you did something wrong? I think the most powerful lesson of the Korbanot is that it's so embedded into the Jewish way of life. Unfortunately, we don't bring Korbanot today. We don't have any real counterpart to Korbanot. The whole idea of Korbanot was, you made a mistake, I did something wrong, I broke Shabbos. Whatever happened, you broke Shabbos, I didn't know it was Shabbos, and I boiled an egg on Shabbos. You don't just shrug your shoulders. You don't just say, okay, who cares about Shabbos? Because of course we care about Shabbos. I'm a person of faith. God wants me to keep Shabbos. Shomer es Yom HaShabbos lekadsho. It's one of the Aseres HaDibros. We have to keep Shabbos. We had it in Parshas Bechukoisai, right? That you have to keep Shabbos. Parshas, at the beginning of Parshas of Vayakhel, what's the first thing it says? You want to build a Mishkan, you've got to keep Shabbos. Shabbos is important. You can't shrug your shoulders. So I've broken Shabbos, my life is over. I can't continue with my life. I broke Shabbos, what's the point? No. You can say sorry. You can bring a Korban Chatos. The whole of Maseches Shabbos, one after another, we have all these different things which you can do on Shabbos, which is wrong, but it's okay. You can bring a Corbyn Chatos. You can actually go to God and say, I'm sorry. Now, are there consequences? Not after you've said sorry, not after you've brought a Corbyn Chatos. If you don't bring a Corbyn Chatos, there's consequences, because it means that you're not perfect as a person. But if you know how to say sorry, that makes you a perfect person. People who can accept apologies from those they care about, they're good people. People who can apologize when they've done something wrong that affects someone that they care about, they're good people. People who can never admit to doing wrong, or can never accept when someone has wronged them, they're not good people. And that's something that's embedded into the Jewish faith. We have a whole book, the book of Vayikra, that gives us the lists of all the different korbanot that you can bring and should bring in circumstances where you've not been perfect. And, of course, present company excluded. Who's perfect in this world?
Absolutely. I've never thought of this sefer as I've always thought of it as a book about service, about sort of a tangible worship of God. And I guess I haven't thought about it really as an expression of personal atonement and really accountability, right? That's what it is. It creates
That's
a system.
what it is. It's about being able to accept that you're not perfect and you're going to make mistakes. And when you make mistakes, you can actually undo those mistakes if you're willing to acknowledge them and do something about them.
Absolutely. What a powerful thought for this week's Parsha. I highly recommend and advise everyone to go out and buy Rabbi Dunner's book, because I don't know about you, but I am certainly put on the spot to deliver a Dvar Torah, a short but powerful Dvar Torah very often, and this is just a treasure trove of gems. So thank you so much for writing this, for putting this out, for Margaret's Torah, and for sitting down today to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I know that the book is just arrived in the United States. It's still in customs. The delivery is still in customs at Newark, New Jersey. And hopefully we'll hit the bookstores and Amazon over the next week. And I know that if you're interested in the book, you can certainly email my office at yinbh.org, and they'll be able to help you and assist you in getting your copy. And thank you so much to all those who joined. But I particularly want to thank Avital for having engaged with me on the topics that we've discussed. Thank you.